special episode of Do the Work today. We'll get into the subject at hand, which is kind of a conversational book club, audio book club, podcast club review of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. But before we do that, we've got some special guests joining us today that have endured two things that we should praise them for. Number one, they endured the entirety of the Mars Hill podcast, in part getting preparation for this. But they've endured knowing us in different parts of our lives long enough to be willing to step into this box and participate. And so if there's anything more praiseworthy than that level of confidence right now, I don't think we can really rise to that spot. But joining us today is Chris Emerson, Jeremy Bard, and Hal Hammonds. There's a class clown that has self-identified himself as well. I was going to ask a question, but the ability to wrangle the five of us into a short manner is just zero. So there's too much talking going on. But
by the way, I love Emerson's T-shirt. Emerson, show that shirt. Show that off.
Shout out to my daughter Hannah. She got me this shirt yesterday, and I'm going to preach.
We all need much more Jesus.
Wait. Wind that back. You preaching that on Sunday?
No, that was not true.
Because I was like, I can join the club. I can find a shirt.
You should put that. You should wear that under your suit, and the invitation just rip your shirt open and be like, "This, if you want much more Jesus."
Like, how much better is that than a tie? I mean, let's get real.
Dude,
anyway,
yeah. I mean, I didn't wear a tie Sunday, so I think it's great.
Terry, you got anything before we get into this? I know you've known Jeremy longer than I have.
Listen, Jeremy Bard
he's fresh.
Jeremy Bard once dressed up as me for Halloween, but he was actually just half of me. Him and his roommate went as me. Jeremy used to fit in one side of my pants. That's how small he used to be. And
not anymore.
And his roommate Bill will still fit in one side of my pants because unlike Jeremy, Bill is the same he's always been. Kim has taken good care of Jeremy. That's all I'm saying. But we've known each other a long time. And, I mean, I know all these guys and I love all of them. I pick on Chris a lot, but I love Chris. Chris is a great guy.
Yeah.
And Hal, they all do good work. So looking forward to today. But, yeah, Jeremy and I go way back. He's worn half of my pants for Halloween, which was kind of funny. There's a picture around there somewhere that just stinks.
I have a picture of it. It is you can't recognize me at all, but it's really fun.
Yeah. Jeremy was down in Bowling Green at one point. I think he was visiting somebody or another. Maybe Kim was down visiting somebody, and we're going to Bible study, but we had to stop and we had to bring a dish. And so Jeremy was convinced that the best dish possible was to make banana pudding, and he himself was the best craftsman to produce that banana pudding. And so I don't know if he still feels so strongly about his pudding, but it's probably the case.
Well, it is still, I mean, it's the best dessert ever invented by man. I mean, banana pudding is the number one dessert you could ever think about having.
Yeah,
I was introduced to the hot banana pudding versus cold banana pudding controversy in my days in the Deep South. Do you have any positions on that?
Well, I'm certainly a cold banana pudding guy in every way. I'd like a good hot dessert, but that needs to be a nice pie, maybe. But pudding has to be cold. Pudding has to be cold. If it's not, it's oatmeal or porridge or so whatever. That's what's hot.
Me and Bart are going to start doing a foodie podcast after this. Like, I think we should just the two of us. Do that. Yeah, we just need to talk smoked meats, pies, banana pudding, cookies, all the things. Listen, Emerson, if you're going to jump into the discussion, I hate to tell you this, but it's the skinniest guy on this screen right now, Emerson. You have no credibility when it comes to food.
You guys know when you go preach somewhere, they always ask you what you like. What do you like? What do you not like? And so I'll tell them I like banana pudding. And so what happens all week, But what's funny about me, and maybe Jeremy agrees, like there's a really nice, detailed, ingredient-oriented, homemade banana pudding that people make that's hot, meringue. I don't really like that. I like the cheap stuff from Walmart pudding aisle.
No.
Fresh vanilla wafers and a few bananas, like mine, like an 8-year-old can make. But I mean, I still like hot meringue banana pudding, but not like the.
You probably like that cheesecake from the pudding aisle too, instead of the Cheesecake Factory. You like that cheap stuff that goes in the refrigerator overnight.
Now you've raised the stake, man. Cheesecake
Hey,
Factory.
give me the real banana pudding. If she didn't have to stand over the stove and stir it for 15 minutes, it ain't good, man. That's all I'm saying. Hey, we need to get to the topic. We could talk this all day.
Yeah, that was the obvious thing. I didn't have to ask a question because I can just mention any kind of food and everyone's going to jump in like a bunch of rabid dogs.
Driscoll, Mars Hill, let's
accurate.
go.
Yeah,
Hi, Edwin.
so well, we got our chat section is now completely full. No space for anybody else.
Good news is the devil's advocate showed up. Bad news is normally we have 8 people by now, but since 3 of them are joining us, we've only got 2.
That's right. One of the Hammonds boys is on the show, so you can only get one of them in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's get down to the heart of the matter. Yeah, we've kind of joked around a little bit, and we love having Edwin here. It's always good. It's always good to hassle him because he hassles us. The Mars Hill context is super important to those who are intrigued, concerned, and interested in congregational leadership, and the impact that the decisions made in that familial community space can have on the work of Christians together. Mars Hill, for those who are unaware, we're going to talk about it just in a generic sense, began as a single site. I sometimes derivatively say McChurch, but it wasn't initially supposed to be that way. It eventually kind of expanded and mutated into a more bland but aggressive form of a box church model where you had a centralized church and then satellite units that were subservient to the mothership. And that also included a lot of stress on relationships and what seems to be, from the outside looking in, a fairly disruptive or toxic leadership environment, heavily unmanaged and a lot of ego going on. And so all of us have listened to a series of podcasts about that through the last, I don't know how long for some of you. I started with episode 1 or 2 when it was starting to be released. And I was like, oh, I got to listen to all of this.
Yeah.
And I know Chris kind of binged on it on a road trip and some driving and traveling. And he was like, wow, as we talked about it. And I know that's probably the case for some of the other guys. And so what we're going to do is step back and look at it in part from a big picture thing. We're going to macro it, and then we'll narrow back in and say, hey, here's some key things. I've got a few key takeaways that I've identified. I'm also going to be quiet at this point too and kind of take a back seat because people hear my voice way too much. But for Jeremy, Hal, and Chris, and Terry can do whatever he wants, what were your initial reactions when you started listening to the podcast, and how did the ebb and flow go? Terry, you got something first?
Yeah, I want to say this, unless anybody really hasn't listened to the podcast, to say this, because I think it's important. And you guys can chime in on this too if you want, or just kind of move past it. This podcast is not about our doctrinal differences with Mark Driscoll. And I think that's really important to go into that, because I've talked to some people who are upset that they don't dive into the doctrinal differences more. And you got to understand the people who are producing this are very evangelical mindset. So that is not their focus at all. Neither is it the focus of the podcast. And so I don't think there's a lot of merit to us talking about that out of just saying, I mean, there's some doctrinal things about Driscoll that are interesting we may talk about, but we're not going to dive into the doctrinal differences. I'll just tell you there are a whole lot of them, and that's not the point. The point of this was really about this toxicity of leadership and the church and Driscoll himself and how it went off the rails. And I think that's where the meat of what this is about, and the benefit of listening to this, is really to focus and hone in on those things. And you guys can talk about whatever you want, but I just wanted people who aren't familiar with this to realize that just because we're not going to talk about doctrinal issues, yes, Edwin, I know I'm talking to you. Just because we're not going to talk about that today doesn't mean we doctrinally agree. And that was not really the emphasis of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. So, Emerson, you got your finger up. Go for it.
I want to be really quick just because I want to stick with what you're saying. As you listen to this whole series and you track a man over 25 years, I don't know that you can lock down his doctrinal position on things. I think he changed dramatically with what was accepted. He was brash when brash worked. He backed up when softness worked. I've changed a lot in my beliefs and things over the years, but it's been a process of having to go, ooh, I was wrong about that, and I've learned this. You don't ever hear him say that. He just, and that's why you can't really, like, is he a Calvinist? Is he not a Calvinist? It depends where he is and what works. My thing about him is I question if he ever has had true faith. You know, he says, I wasn't even in a church. I've never been in a church until I started a church. Well, that's like strike 1, 2, and 3 right there, that you started a thing to accomplish a thing. So fundamentally on the bottom level, I do identify with him. That was my whole purpose. I identify with villains, or anti-heroes is our new terminology for villains. I try to find myself in all of his steps, but one difference between me and him and all of you and him is I never saw true faith integrity at the heart of the decisions that were being made. And that's why, you know, you couldn't have a doctrinal conversation because he'd just yell at you and then he might change it a year later.
He's a businessman is what he is. And he used church was his business. Anyway, so yeah, go ahead, Jeremy. Throw it to you real quick.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I mean, we'll start with the low-hanging fruit. I mean, it at a macro level, it is a man, it is in every way about a man in leadership that had arrogance so high, it was destructive to everything around them. And I mean, it is in every way the 1 Corinthians 10. I mean, it is the, you know, take heed lest you fall, given to us in 12 episodes. And it is on the biggest of levels, especially in the leadership position that he was in. It really goes to show that if you're going to find yourself in whatever leadership position, whether it be in the church, I think whether it be in your workplace or whether it be, you know, in your family, if you're carrying that level of arrogance, destruction is what's going to come out of that. And it may take a year or 2 years or 10 years or 20 years as it took, you know, almost there, but destruction is going to follow that. And, you know, it certainly, I think it was one of the points of the podcast for sure. But, you know, just at the, you know, a generalized first impression macro level, it is the one thing that stands out. Destruction follows that level of arrogance in leadership, no matter the circumstance. Mm-hmm. Church, work, family, doesn't make a difference. Destruction is going to follow.
Yep. How?
Well, along those same lines, and Edwin points out James 3:14 and following about the core of our character, and going back to the provisos that Terry was laying out for us, I would very much like to keep this on a moral and personal character kind of discussion. But there's a certain degree to which the structure of churches in a denominational or non-denominational, whatever you want to call it, setting lends itself to this kind of abuse. If a person feels like I can set up my own church and do things my way, that lends to the cult of personality. It doesn't have to, obviously. Not every church goes Mars Hill on us. But when we get used to the idea of a pastor who's going to be our sole source of spiritual enlightenment, and we get away from personal relationships, we get away from personal accountability, things of that nature. That's probably not the doctrine kind of thing that Terry was talking about. But at its core, it is reading the Bible and doing what the Bible says. And when you have a system set up where someone is encouraged basically to find a model that works, find a model that grows, a model that makes an impact or whatever, the cult of personality is very effective in the short term. I would argue in the long term, it's doomed to disaster. And it certainly was with Mars Hill. But when we make it all about us, and we're, like Chris was saying, we're modifying our doctrine, we're modifying our approach, changing Jesus essentially to fit our own mold, to fit me. Mark Driscoll was very much into the whole militaristic Jesus because he was militaristic. He liked the Jesus on a white horse mentality because he was Clint Eastwood. That's the mentality that he had. He found it convenient to work the church in that direction. Well, when we don't make it about Jesus, we make it about ourselves, we're setting ourselves up for this disaster.
Yeah.
In a sense, I think.
Oh, Terry, go ahead.
Well, in a sense, I don't think he made it even about himself, because I think what it became for him was he was driven by what we would call success religiously in the church, which is growth. And he started off as the shock jock Clint Eastwood guy, who everybody flocked to because he wasn't like any other church. And that's why he bragged about never being in a church till he started one. And he went after guys early on to get attention who were mainstream mega church guys. But then once he came out, and you guys remember there was this turn where he came out with, we're going to be to 15,000 members by X date. And once he came up with that was going to be the measuring stick of his success, he was willing to change everything about what he was publicly in order to get to that success. There is no integrity in Mark Driscoll because if you compare Mark Driscoll at the beginning to the end, like Chris said, you don't know what he believes or what he is, except for a very success-driven, grow or at all costs mentality, which drove him to be a sellout, which is funny because he started off trying to prove he wasn't a sellout for anybody, and that's exactly what he becomes over this 14, 15-year period there at Mars Hill.
Yeah, for me, I had a kind of an interpersonal look at it. It began in the first couple episodes, I was able to see individual experiences highlighted in others around me first. And I was like, oh, I've seen someone behave that way. Oh, I've seen someone behave that way. And then when he started, the reporter started documenting the variations of Driscoll's story of his conversion and commitment. A lot of that story is incredibly similar to mine, my own personal story. And that was enough of a push to help me not only see others in that context, for me to start thinking, wait a minute, is this about me? It's like, is this principle about me in leadership? And so I then shifted from, hey, I've seen this happen. I know this has happened. I've seen people behave this way. I know a guy who did this exact thing, to what am I doing? Because I started looking at it in a more self-reflective way and saying, okay, now how can I see this dumpster fire and see, am I behaving in a way, and is the cultures that I am participatory in behaving in a way that is the dumpster fire? And so it kind of hit me on a more personal level at that point, where I was like, wait a minute. Okay, now what do I need to do? And so I started kind of taking notes through the podcast of, this is super important. Why don't we do this? And it highlights this. Driscoll leans into, in both his preaching and teaching, this is more of a theological thing, into the righteousness of God. Classically, God's judgment, God's punishment. It doesn't mean that he believes those things, but that's what he preaches. But he does so strongly that it washes out God's justice, which is for the oppressed, the downtrodden, the underappreciated. And he's got that scale so offset that he surrounds himself. And I think that's an important thing. So I think it's something to kind of reflect on as we kind of ponder all of this. And we've got someone on YouTube who's identifying themselves as Benjamin Petrie, and it's good to have you here. And if you've got extra comments you want to talk about, we're kind of just digging through it. So let's go back around and talk about like the big picture thing. Like, this is what we kind of saw, what drug us into it, what's going on. I think Edwin does have a good solid point in thinking that the theological concerns should have been highlighted a little more strongly. Again, it's not necessarily the focus of the broadcast that they were putting together. Super valuable though. I think the theology that undergirds the decisions that were made there, regardless of what you might think is the right answer to those questions, really did cause some additional havoc. Chris?
We've talked about how different he is than us in the situation, but the real value of this series is seeing the similarities in our fellowship and in our churches. And things that are similar is numerical growth tends to lend to a lot of free passes. You look back, I was listening to the last episode, and I think Benjamin was in it, and this idea of, he said all these things that were off color and out there, but at the time, we're growing and people are being baptized, and there's just this sense of, as long as more people are coming, this is good, and we are not absolved from that draw. what happens also is that there's usually a man in the middle, and that man is usually the preacher. I'm trying very hard here at Lindale to not be the center figure for the growth, but that's very hard to break that mold. You know, how many people are here because of the guy, and then the guy goes, and then there's all the problems, and that's what happened to them. And so there are a lot of commonalities in what can happen in every church. And for me, the big takeaway is what Samuel said to Saul. When you were little in your own eyes, God used you dramatically and beautifully, but he's insinuating that you became very big in your own eyes. And sometimes the structure lends to that. That's my point. The structure lends to that. The leadership caters to the pastor, the preacher, because he's the voice, and the people just kind of accept the things that he says in the sense of it must be working. And I think my big takeaway is humility. I never picked up anything, and I think it was Benjamin who went and visited the recently in Phoenix. There's never a sense of I'm wrong. There's never a sense of apology. There's never a sense of my doctrine has changed because I was wrong and I've learned something. Never, not a one time. And if I could say one thing to preachers, some of this we can't just change. I wish we could. We can't just change the similarities of the way growth works and catering works. It's an Americanized system that we're in. But what you can do is assess yourself and have mentors. How many times in that podcast was it, I wish there was somebody you'd be accountable to. I wish there was someone who could tell you to stop it and you would stop it. I need people like that. I talked to Philip the other day. You're in next week's episode, Philip, not by name, but by influence. Philip said, stop it. And I stopped it because I respect that guy more than my own, not all the time, but my own pride. Sometimes wisdom can sneak through the own hard shell of self-grandizement. But anyway, those are the similarities to me. Is it really always comes down to being small in your own eyes. Jesus has got to be bigger, but so do a lot of more people and more things than yourself.
Yeah.
I think one thing that even on that same line on the numbers, I mean, it's so easy. It's so easy to quantify that, right? I mean, they made mention of it even, during the show where, every year you're able to look back and we were at 1,500 and then we were at 3,000 and the next year we're at 5,000. So it's such an easy, thing to quantify and to keep tabs on. But I think also almost the way that he was preaching and what he preached, he knew was resonating. And so he would hear from people. They loved that kind, multiple times. And, just the interviews they did, that people were drawn because he was speaking differently than everybody else was speaking. So he knew that. And so once he knew that was bringing in the people, that became all that he did. And I think that there is a temptation for that, maybe on a different level for us, that, there's a certain type of lesson or a certain style of lesson that you really, you throw out there and it resonates with a bunch of people. And you're like, well, I'm going to do that then all the time. And now if you head in that lane, what is being missed? And I think in a lot of ways, that's what happened there, maybe on a different level, but that's something that personally that I was thinking a lot about because, it's always, hey, this type of lesson really, really hit with people. Well, I'm going to do that again. And then I'm going to do that again. And then suddenly is that all the preaching that I'm doing? And now we're missing, some other things. And he was huge, into that because that's what was resonating with people. That was at least in the interviews. They're like, oh, he's, nobody cursed from the pulpit. I love that. Or, he was so brash and he was, really, that kind of fire. And so he knew that resonated and that's the way he went and never, ever pulled off of it. And I think Chris is right. I don't even know if that's him. I mean, I don't know if we would ever know what his true personality really is because he just became, that celebrity preacher because it became all about the numbers. And I don't know if it even started with that, but it certainly ended with that for sure.
Yeah. I don't know if we can quantify that. How?
Well, the problem with focusing on the numbers is we're taking our eyes off the goal and congratulating ourselves for it because we think that we are doing great things. And I touched on this on my podcast this week. The idea of us coming together as the people of God. This is what it's all about. It's easy to convince ourselves that the job in the local church is to baptize people or to make sure every Bible class has a teacher or appoint elders or appoint deacons or get the preacher a raise, whatever it happens to be. We come together as the people of God to be the body of Christ. That is our job. as the local church. And as a result of that, things going according to plan, these other things get done. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes we struggle with our numbers. Look at the 7 churches of Asia. You know, some of them are doing well, some of them are not doing well. But God's definition of well and not well are not necessarily the same as ours. If we can back up from this obsession about numbers and about results and about tangible things and focus on being Christians, being in fellowship with one another, growing together in love, Ephesians chapter 4 kind of stuff. If we can do that, then the numbers will by and large take care of themselves. It's all about our character more than about the results that we can quantify and put on a spreadsheet.
We've also got to realize that evangelism is about sharing the gospel, not about converting people. It's about sowing the seed. It's not about how much of the seed grows. And I think that's one of our misnomers is we're number driven. We treat this like a sales position, and it's not, because if it was, we'd all be fired. We're terrible salesmen in that sense, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the reality is that evangelism is sowing the seed, period, regardless of how people respond to it. And it is easy for us to get just lured into that results-driven mentality. Listen, I said this, it's been a couple weeks ago. We said, and I can't remember if it was on here, and I think it was in another discussion. The thing about preaching is if you judge preaching by the world's success standards, we are all failures. Like, we get up every week, we do our best job. All 5 of us have prepared. And I mean, how many times have you been there and preached your heart out, and there's 2 or 3 people that need to come forward or go talk to the elders after it or whatever, and nothing. And you're like, okay, that's just how that goes, I think, at the end of the day. And so you got to get away from this looking at the numbers thing. And by the way, that was one of the takeaways for me. It's one of the things I saw myself in. There was a time where we tracked our baptisms and we talked about how many baptisms we had. The funny part was we talked about how many baptisms we had. Like, one year we had 36, and then, a couple of years later you look and only 5 of them are still Christians. And then you realize, hey, the retention rates and all these other numbers, it's just not, at the end of the day, all that's kind of self-promotion and all that. I mean, that was one of the takeaways. That's not our job. It's not our job.
Well, contrast Paul's attitude in 1 Corinthians 1, was it 17? Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Contrast that with Mark Driscoll, for instance, who is perfectly prepared to take credit for absolutely everything in absolutely every situation. Paul's saying, not only do I not deserve the credit, I don't want the credit. It's not about me. It's not about numbers. It's about us together pursuing the things of Jesus, or not, as the case may be.
The kernel of preaching, there was a comment made, Jeff Carr said, success in preaching, how often the truth is taught, and in the spirit of love. As I'm studying this whole series, and I'm thinking, how am I like this guy? How am I different? What are the warning signs? One of the places where I feel like we diverged, and it matters to me, and it gets emphasized in the last episode, but really all throughout, is he preaches this strong, you need to do better, and you're dirtbags, and you need to fix it. But it's never, I'm also a dirtbag, and I need to. At the end, it's always, let me tell you about my great marriage. Let me tell you about my great health. Let me tell you about all my great stuff. Like, you're bad, I'm good. So if you would listen to me, then I can help you be good too. And I'll say this, I wrote down some things. I know people get upset with me or my preaching. I get locked into things, and I just series and ideas and much more Jesus, whatever. But I'm going to tell you this, I can say it in honesty. I am preaching what I need or what is changing me. And all the preaching is, guys, I needed this. Did some stuff on Mission of Mercy coming up last week and this week. Like, I need that. And I didn't, when the guy starts elevating himself, it's, I'm a success, you're a failure. So here it comes. This instead, I think preaching should be, none of us are righteous, not even one. But here's something that's helping me. Here's something that's working, and I'm working on it. And that just shows through. So I think if you're a preacher and you're going like, where am I in this scale of pride and self-elevation? Just do the finger rule, pointing. I think pronouns are big. With a lot of your preaching is you need to, you should, or they. They is the worst. Like, who's they anyway? It needs to be we and us and I and me and you. And he just didn't have that. So I think that I'm looking for little indicators of where I am in the size of myself in my own eyes. And that was a divergent path that I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm not that bad yet, you know.
Yeah, I want to insert something really, at least important to me in this. When you look at this context, one of the biggest concerns for me is the podcast puts a lot of the weight on Driscoll where it should be. That's really where a lot of this weight should exist, 100%. But what I saw in that is the destruction of lives who were willing to begin a process of committing themselves to godly things, being rolled underneath the theological problems, the growth pressure issues, and there was no care for them as human beings made in the image of God. They became oranges to squeeze the last drop out of. And let me place it in a context that most of our typical listeners will be familiar with. That's how we tend to treat resources within the local church. Oh, you can teach a Bible class? Okay, you're teaching for the next 6 years. And you'll never be in a Bible class again, even though you might need to be refreshed. Oh, you can do this thing? Well, that's all you're going to do now for every Sunday forever. You're going to do that thing. Like, don't you need a little season of growth and maturity in other areas? We squeeze abilities out of people, treating them like they were, well, you're just a two talent guy, so we're going to squeeze those 2 talents out of you. But we're not going to let you grow into a 10 talent guy. This is in the context of balancing these things out, being aware of our interactions, but also creating a culture in the groups that we participate in that has the appropriate safety nets to prevent that problem in the lives of the individuals. Because when we go away from this macro stuff, one of the things that hit me super hard was in one of the most recent broadcasts when they were reflecting on the experiences that individuals had gone through. And a moment occurred in this guy's workplace. And he's like, I felt everything back on top of me again. And it was like I was having, and he uses the terminology saying, I was having basically PTSD about a church context. I know many individuals who preach the gospel. Many have served in leadership roles in their churches. And that's not unique to that one human, that one man, that one person. And some of the women that talked on the record, that one couple of women toward the end of the broadcast talked about her inability to fully process everything that had happened and how hard it was to accept everything was going to be okay again. Those who preach, those who serve in leadership roles, elders, deacons, etc., you are still responsible for people more than you are for things, no matter what your role is. And the more we can kind of get that into the conversation, the better we're going to be doing both those people roles and their thing roles. And look, we should be excellent at it. I guarantee you that when Edwin was getting ready for his awesome message at last year's Florida College lectures, he practiced that message 10 times. I say 10, a lot, because it was important. It was an important message to frame a good message for that time. But he's also super concerned about people. And we've got to be able to kind of keep those things in play of excellence in work, but excellence in relationships, I think, needs to be in there in some way too.
I was really hit.
By the way,
I was really hit by the wake of destruction that Mars Hill left in the Seattle community. I mean, the other story that got me was when the guy goes to apply for a job and they found out he worked at Mars Hill and they walked out and didn't even tell him they weren't going to interview him. He just sat there for like 20 minutes until he finally left on his own. And I guess, we got to realize in what we do that there's real people and real lives at stake here. One of the things that a lot of them said that, and this is one of the interesting things, is that Driscoll's kind of the anti-hero here, as Chris called him earlier. And he gets to walk away from the mess and go to Arizona and keep some of the intellectual property and really has very few consequences. And you got people that are losing their houses, can't find jobs, the sad part is that the people left behind, their lives were severely altered by what happened. And while we look at that and go, well, that's because of the false doctrine and the structure and the way they set up, the same thing can happen to us. Listen, when churches split, people, and I tell people all the time that we need to avoid division at all costs, because it's like a family divorce, and the kids, it's custody hearing, who goes where. It's destructive. And you see that here. It was a wake up call too. These are real people that we work with every week. And we got to think about beyond ourselves in all of this. Now, obviously Driscoll failed at that. That's one of his biggest problems. He's so self-centered in all of this, but that just really impressed me. Large, kind of impression on me in all of that. Chris, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I want to just work off of that too, this lack of real concern for people. But I want to tie it to another point on humility, but I think it connects. And if you're wondering where you are on the Driscoll scale, how do you handle criticism? I'm not talking about from some loony bin guy on the left. I'm talking about, or even that one person in church that picks on you for everything. I'm talking about when leadership questions you, when people critique your work, when they question you or correct you. Like, what's your impulse on that? He squashed, first of all, every opposition to him was considered a bug, and he squashed them. The stories are just filled with people that got ran out of there. Of course, when it came his time, he was the victim. How interesting, he's always been the victim, and preachers get into that. We're the victim. The elders are picking on me, and these people want me to do this, and they don't understand. And that's pride ratcheting up when we don't question ourselves and we're not willing to change and reevaluate. And that's something that I need to think about more. I've not always been good at that. As soon as somebody criticizes me, I marginalize them. And there are a variety of ways you do that. You look at the success you've had in preaching and you marginalize them. Or you look at some of the things that they've said in the past and you do that. Or you call your preacher friends and you go, you're not going to, and then I reframe what they said. You're not going to believe what they said. And I put all these tones to it and wordings to it, to where all four of you guys go, oh, Chris, man, you've been so mistreated, and you need to stand up for yourself, or you need to move. And how often have we done that? Like, this dude did that every time. And I'm really working on self-eval here, and there are ways that he and I are not the same, but man, there is a piece of him in every one of the guys I'm looking at right now, by nature of being a man and by nature of our career, our work, and just our self-evaluation.
I'll tell you one quick thing to add to all of that, especially, one thing you think about, especially with the people, Phil kind of started that, and Terry and Chris, that's what leadership is. It has to be about the people. I make the point often about marriage, especially, but, it fits in, the situation that we are in, the choices that we've made is that, right? When you get married, it is a choice. Nobody forced you into that. You have chosen that. And when you choose that, you have chosen to now be responsible for another person, right? Same thing if you're going to become a parent. It is a choice that's made. When you make that choice, you now are taking on the responsibility of those people. And the same way in all of the careers that we have chosen, nobody forced any of us to be preachers or evangelists. Nobody forced us to do that. We have chosen that. And because we have chosen that, now we take on the responsibility of the people. And you have the situation, what we saw with Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll specifically, is he lost sight of all of the people around him. Now, it only became about him. Now, he would oftentimes say the right thing, even going back to, Edwin's comment about, doctrine. What I would giggle every time they would, quote him of, the point where he made, I'm so-and-so's pastor, but Jesus is my pastor. They had that quote, several times. Well, that wasn't the case. He wasn't listening or following or, doing anything like Jesus would want him to do. That just came out so easy for him. He could care less about the people. I think even his own family included. He could care less about those people. And he only cared about himself. And that is something we've got to keep an eye out for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's something valuable for us as we are trying to figure out how we're going to move our hearts in a way that says we need to make sure the gospel is the focus of our work. We need to say that gospel is reaching individuals who are not just part of the flock, but outside the flock in ways that are healthy. And then make a next step and say, okay, now what is actually my role in doing that? Like, where do I need to position myself so that the cross is actually seen rather than me. And the foot of the cross is a great place to be in that process. I think that's something that is the end point for this. Like Driscoll's behavior, it really mimics every person's potential behavior, in that he shows that we can allow our abilities to cast shadows on the cross itself. And we can tell ourselves all the good reasons why that's the case. Well, I'm the best one doing this. Like, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it. That presumes the idea that what you're doing actually needs to be done. Like, it may not need to be done right now. Like, these are all possibilities. And I think there's another layer of this too that's really hard for us to process. In that, all the theology aside, our culture emboldens, and I say our community culture, even amongst the churches we're connected to, emboldens success above substance.
Yeah.
And success is a shifting metric, but whatever a person defines as success, we then immediately become willing to cover so the success stays. And the success could be, we've got one of the best speakers in the pulpit in the land. You need to come hear him. The success could be, this guy is super unique. Man, he's so awesome. You need to come hear him. The success could be, everybody here thinks the same thing. We're successful because we are united. Yeah, okay, great. All 8 of you are united. Awesome. And yes, it was derivative by intention. It could be 800 and you have the same outcome.
By the way,
that's something. Go ahead, Terry.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, you're right. And I wanted to get down to Paul Hammonds' comment before. I know Hal wants to bring something up that we need to get to. But as he said, once Mark left, it fell apart because there was no connection. But that's because the connection angle at Mars Hill was never to each other. Mm-hmm. The whole focus at Mars Hill was to come and connect to Mark. That's why you came to Mars Hill, was to be connected to Driscoll. And it goes back to what Emerson said earlier about, and listen, I've had times where I've had leadership tell me, well, you're the guy that's up front all the time. So like we've got to do a better job of not being that guy. Like that was one of the things that came out. We got to be a better job at family building and connectivity. Because the thing is, and I think most of us agree, I know all of us agree this. If we move, this church has to live on without us. It can't be built on us. Like that. So the fallacy from the beginning is that it's not even about connectivity to anybody but Mark. And it was about Phil. He was the success of the church. He was the one that was the measurable success. And as a part of that, I want to get to Hal, and then I know Emerson, you got your hand up, but Hal requested this earlier. Part of that feeding the success in Mark led to what brings him down, which is the ironic part. I mean, because he has this kind of persona to fulfill now, and that led him to do things that ultimately is what brings the destruction upon himself. Hal, you want to speak to that?
Well, yeah, I thought it was really interesting. We were talking about this image that we're trying to build, and I've heard stories about the New York Times bestseller list and people gaming the system. Basically, I don't think I've ever heard of a church doing that, but spending all of these church funds to buy books in a particular place so that you'll appear on a list one time, so your pastor will be a New York Times bestselling author for the rest of his life, and spending oodles of church funds for this, ostensibly because it's going to build your brand, and in the long run, you're going to make your money back and this kind of thing. I don't know if fiscally necessarily that makes a whole lot of sense, but it's not too difficult to see the cynical, sad, carnal nature of that. It's about numbers, it's about reputation, it's about money. And I find it ironic that money is what brings this all crumbling down in the end. With all success. the stories that were circulating about Driscoll, all the horror stories and the blog posts and this kind of thing, what winds up bringing the tower crumbling down is plagiarism, which is essentially money. He's caught red-handed stealing somebody else's intellectual property, which essentially takes money out of somebody else's pocket. Well, now all of a sudden we got a problem. Now we got to deal with this because that's an actual crime. Well, okay, in a sense, yes, it is. And certainly I'm not in favor of plagiarism by any stretch of the imagination. But why is it that this draws our ire? Why is it this that gets all the attention rather than this human carnage that is left in the wake of this so-called success that we're seeing here?
Yeah, I think I'll kind of put it this way. I would argue that the plagiarism, which is a super interesting intersection with current cultural issues, because the blog that Benjamin pointed us to earlier in the broadcast, which all of you should go dig around if you'd like to read instead of listen. Throckmorton's blog is awesome because it creates some great intersectional comments with other issues of academic honesty and stuff as well. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. All these other issues were already pushing on him, but this is the one that got large enough and big enough that no longer could they manage it anymore. So it was the last push. And should it be that way? No, absolutely not. It should never have gotten to that dumpster fire level where the flames were so high they couldn't close the lid on it anymore. And I think there's, something to say for smaller communities in that same space. The churches we're associated with do not live in the New York Times bestsellers list. But I'll just speak plain this way. You don't think that gospel preachers generationally haven't been treated positively and negatively just like Driscoll has? Anyone know Foy Wallace? And I pick someone who can't defend themselves, but I can include living names. I can include our names if I wanted to in that same sentence. But I think that's something important to process.
I was
Chris?
going to make some thoughts.
Emerson.
First of all, Terry and Edwin kind of have a back and forth going in the comments, and I think they're both right. I mean, at first it was all about this. They were all sharing everything, and they were really doing great. And then as his brand began to build in the later episodes, the downtown church seemed to be doing better than all the other churches. They had this great pastor down there. They were reaching people like crazy, but he wasn't falling in line with Mark's vision of Mark. And so he gets fired. He's like the best thing they had left, and he gets run out. So eventually it got made to be where everybody had to fall in line. When I relate this to us, I just want to do a call to leadership. I know we have some shepherds who watch this program, and the call to leadership is we need your help. And I could go through a long discourse, but let me see if I can shorten it. In the case of non-denominational churches that grow, you have a single man who is two P words. He is the pastor and he is the power. Okay. Pastor means he does all the feeding, all the counseling. He gets to know all the members. He eventually hired all that out, but he created connections to all the people. He is the messenger of truth, and he had all the power. Now, in churches of Christ, non-denominational as we are, we understand that's inappropriate. So here's what has happened, I think, in America. We say, that's no good, so let's take the power away. So now look at what we have. We have a pastor doing all the preaching, teaching, connecting, leading, the guy they answer to, but all the power is in the room in the back, and you have the elders. This is a bad system. It's it's as bad of a system, and it's one of the reasons why we have preachers getting out of the work and fewer getting into the work, and churches don't know what's going on, and they're all getting small because this guy gets hit by a bus, and they don't know what to do. They just need another feeder. We need another pastor. We got the power. We've got the power. So what we need shepherds to do is, it's fine to have a guy who does the preaching, but please become pastors. Like, you need to know the people. You go to their home. Create a connection so that if Chris or Edwin or any of the guys I'm looking at, if we get hit by a bus tomorrow, the people who feed this flock, who they trust was huge in this program. They trusted one guy. Everybody else is expendable. If the trust is in the leadership, then you can weather it with a guy who's a great preacher who does great sermons. But we have a powerless pastor system in 21st century churches of Christ that is failing just as quickly And we need them to step up and work that. And at the same time, the preachers have to be willing to give that, to say, you know what, you take those families, you take the lead. I'm here to serve your purpose. And I know I get excited about it because I think this is a fundamental issue in churches, and we better fix it. And it starts with us, but we need leadership to help us.
We got to get those two people in the same room. That's the key. Same room, same page, same understanding. It's a cooperative work. That's the interesting thing there. And that's where, and we've done podcasts about the business model and how the power and the preacher and all the relations. Our problem is it's very biblical. Ephesians 4 says that the evangelists and the pastors are to work together to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. You can't do that in two separate rooms. Like, you just can't do that when you're not on the same page. And part of that, to follow up with Chris's point, is for the preachers to realize they're not pastors, and to emphasize that the guys with the power are the pastors and they're teachers, and to get them, we've got to stop thinking that the power guys in their room, their job is to administrate over the church. Their job is to watch after souls and teach. And we've got to get back to that model. That's the biblical model. And that's not, listen, because I think one of the things that I saw here too was, and it was a wake-up call for me, is there were elders at Mars Hill who tried to hold Driscoll accountable, and they ended up being in a pile of dead bodies behind the bus. Like, there were guys that tried to do that, and they weren't allowed. So like Chris said, we play a role in this of making sure people understand how this is supposed to all go together and work together. And I think both sides have done a bad job of that historically, at least in my lifetime.
That bus imagery was very, very prominent, obviously, in the Mars Hill culture, and Driscoll made no bones about who was driving the bus. You know, this is my church, this is my ministry, this is, you know, my bus. Basically, you get on board with me or you don't, and that's just the way that it's going to be. It's prideful, it's arrogant, it's all of the above. We can't have churches like that. And there are preachers that have that kind of personality. There's this domineering kind of personality. It's not a sin to be a strong personality, but it's a sin to use that strong personality to take over the church. And when you look at 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, you see men who do not have the powerful personalities, at least not necessarily. You see servants, you see workers, you see people of character that care about people, that are examples to the flock. That's the kind of leadership that God says his people need. And that's not the kind of leadership that we want sometimes. We want the big mouth. We want the bully. We want the guy who to stand up and take charge and tell us what's what, and you know, drive the bus, no matter who it runs over. And God's way is better.
And
I'm gonna get to Jeremy, but can we say one word of 2014? Those elders, I think it was really great that they went back to the scripture and they drew up accounts against him based on what was in the scripture. They developed the truth of that, and they sought to mercifully and kindly help him get better. I thought that was a beautiful ending. You know, Edwin made a comment about people listening to this from that church. That was a fantastic. It should have happened earlier. The structure wasn't there for it. Things got out of hand. But I thought that was a wonderful way to wrap up this series with, here's what the text says. You're not doing what the text says. We put in the work. And ultimately, it was one of the things that exposed that there was no humility left in this man. Right. So the credit to the leadership, and most of the time that's where the credit ends up. Sorry, Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, you said, you know, some of, you know, preachers, you know, have that strong person. I would say most. I think, you know, it almost lends itself in that direction. You know, I'll speak, you know, just for myself. I have a strong personality. I've always had a strong personality, and people know me, tell me I have a strong personality, right? And so the whole time you're trying to now realize, going to what Chris's point was, of what my role is here in the local work that I'm a part of. And my role is not the power, right? And it is that, am I able to have the humility to allow the ones, our shepherds, to do and to take their role on, and, you know, to focus in on my role. And it takes that level of humility, and something certainly that I work on all the time. But in this podcast that we all listen to, you found people that were in roles but didn't understand their roles, and certainly weren't fulfilling the roles in any way. And anytime you have that, whether it's a church, whether it's the family, in whatever capacity, it's going to crumble. And ultimately, that's that's what you saw.
But one of the things, by the way, that impressed me of this story is that we can't read that, Chris. One of the things that impressed me, by the way, because I think there were some good things, is that I was listening to part of this and realized there it is. If Mars Hill operated the way most churches that I've worked with operated in 2014, where there's a problem, he'd have been automatically fired and discarded and given 2 months. And one of the things that impressed me was when there was an issue, when there was something going on, there was an attempt by the existing leadership to allow a period of grace and time to try to work through the situation. And I do think that there's a lesson there that sometimes, rather than just firing your preacher, sometimes you need to allow a time of grace and opportunity to work with the man. I mean, think about Aquila and Priscilla, who went with Apollos and taught him the way more correctly. Today, they would just go fire the guy and tell him to get a realtor. I mean, so I think there's something there to be said for that as well. That was a positive, that they were willing to be forgiving, practice grace, allow for a period of time. But the problem was, as Chris pointed out, they gave, they basically said, we're going to take a year to look at this. And it just became evident there's no repairing this situation. And that was because of who Driscoll is at his core, obviously. And I'm not saying you hang on to you, but I do think there needs to be more grace extended sometimes in some of these situations.
Yeah, was anybody else like
money? Some might
Chris.
say, well, they were protecting. A cynic might say, they were protecting their interests. They worked there. The thing was, if they lose Mark, they lose, and they did, didn't they? They filed for bankruptcy and they did the thing. But I don't look at it cynically, even if that was a part of it. Like, we built this thing and it matters, and he's a part of it. I know Terry can tell stories. I've got a story of my own. I was at a church 5 years, 5th year, elders and I just went sideways. And, the elders were like, well, let's just get rid of this voice, and that'll make everything better. What we should have done is understood what was being built and how crucial all of us were to it. And we should have worked it out together. And then you end up with all of these terrible, they always end so badly because division begets division, elders and preachers divide. What do you think everybody else is going to do? And so, you may question their motives a little bit, but I don't. I look at it as a full system of, we need to work this out together because division is only going to create more division. Sorry, Philip.
Yep.
No, it's fine. I was going to ask this question, which I think kind of extends the subject into a new area. Were any of you surprised or taken aback when you learned that Driscoll was paying for his research through the business that he was contracting with? Were you like, I didn't even know that was a thing? I don't know anyone would do that. The primers that he's getting are graduate to near doctoral level introductions to his series, and then he's just straight up pulling from that to produce whatever he produces.
No, I emailed
guys
5 feelers out to kids. I emailed 5 feelers out to Bible students at a college to see if they'd do it for me. I'd pay them a little bit of money on the side to do my research. I'm kidding. I mean, no, I was not surprised. Because again, this is all, as you said earlier, Phil, this is all success driven. And they hired a team to tell him how to be successful. And they followed all that to the T, I mean, nothing there surprised me. Yeah, yes, and Edwin brings this up. The SBC right now has that going on. This is, by the way, what happened to Driscoll with the New York Times bestseller and all that stuff. He's not the only one that got under that bus, pun intended. And the bodies, the mountain of bodies behind that bus is still piling up. There's more heads to roll on the New York Times and the research group and the plagiarism. That stuff is still going on. We may hear about that for a while.
Well, it goes back to the whole idea of building the brand. Part of building the brand is product. You got to get Driscoll's name on stuff. You got to get it on a lot of stuff. You got to get it out in front of people as much as you possibly can. And, I'm sure that Mark Driscoll's a very busy guy. He didn't have time to write all these books. He barely had time to put together his sermons. There we go. And that's the book.
The book.
The book.
The book that took it down.
So it's not surprising at all that he uses outside researchers, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that. There are all kinds of famous people who write books, with so-and-so, and you kind of know the with so-and-so is the one who's doing most of the writing, and that comes with it. But his name is on it, right? He's getting partial credit for this. That's appropriate. That's proper. One person brings in the crowd and the other person does the actual work. It's a cooperative arrangement. When one person doesn't do any of the work and gets all the credit, it feeds into this notion that it's not about the work. It's not about the church even. It's about the head. It's about the person driving the brand. And when a church is built entirely on the brand, it becomes very difficult to see the difference between propping up the pastor and propping up the gospel. There's no reason to distinguish between the two. Eventually, the house is going to come tumbling down. You know it. And you'd really rather it happen next year or in 5 years than happen now. But we're just putting off the inevitable. It's an unworkable model.
Don't you guys wonder how much input this co-writer had in this book and in a lot of what we talked about? That's one of the voices I wish I could hear about more, would be Mark's wife and some of this stuff. I just got to be honest. That was one of the things that came up to me a lot in my mind.
The plagiarism stuff did not surprise me. Here was my mental picture. Here's a talented speaker, an opinionated guy who just wants to say what he wants to say. He needs a little bit of Bible in there. He needs some neat facts and figures and ideas. And so each week he pays money and people dump data on his desk. He doesn't read the articles. He's that guy. He doesn't read the books. He said he read a book a day. That's a lie, right? That's all part of the image. And he picks things that he wants. And then he did say he preached through the Bible a lot. I've not heard any of those sermons. If I did, I suspect what I would hear is a couple of verses from the chapter and then his big presentation. And we can all fall victim to that. Again, think about it. There are very talented people on this panel right now. Shane's in here. Scott, he's talented. Edwin's talented. Most of you guys could just take a neat factor figure from someone, a couple of verses, and you could build a sermon that everybody loved. And you could see how he did that. So when he wrote the books, he just said what he wanted to say, and he threw data in there. That's how plagiarism happens. It happens when you just grab the pieces you need and you build and you let your talent kind of run. And I think we all just need to think about that. I'll compare him to another guy who's not of our fellowship. But I like David Platt, man. I like to listen to David. When David preaches the text, like when he says, I'm going to preach through 1 Corinthians, that dude's preaching through 1 Corinthians. And he's reading that text and he's making his points and he's using his hands and he's crying and he's awesome. But it's very, very different. And I just think that this is why scripture intensive study and those kinds of things are needed for preachers, because it's super tempting. I did a lesson last week on Luke 15 about the three stories, the lost sheep and coin and son. And I preached the text and tried to do my best, but I was reading Linsky or something. And he talked about how the woman is the church and she had 10 coins on a necklace. And I was like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever heard. And I preached it. And I mentioned it, and it was so good, but it was like tempting to go, let me just go find somebody who's got like a really cool tidbit of data that nobody's heard before. And that's how you end up not preaching the text, missing the point, and plagiarizing, because it's a grab game because you're the talented one. You're the one that's going to give that random article's quote life. But it wasn't your quote, And so I feel how that happens, I guess.
I think
and
also
preachers like us I'm sorry, I was just going to say, and preachers like us are almost certainly going to get away with it. It's Driscoll ultimately is going to get caught, but we probably wouldn't get caught.
Yeah. I mean, all that was happening when it was more of the show. I mean, every time he was preaching, his mind was, this is a show that I'm performing. And when we begin to think that way, the scripture, the text, the truth, it takes a back seat. And you can, full circle back to where Edwin was, at the very beginning. Doctrinally, he wasn't concerned about the doctrine in any way. He was concerned about the show. And I'm the performer, and I'm the best at it. And this church has to have me. And I think ultimately for that group, in a lot of ways, he proved his point. Sadly, kind of proved his point a little bit.
And it's funny how his doctrine and his connections and what he talked about, you can track that with the growth and with his focus. Whereas, initially he doesn't like Piper. He talks about Piper. Then all of a sudden he's with Piper all the time. And
right.
You see all these things that are just along the way. And I think even doctrinally you see that. I mean, one of the things they did say about doctrine is, basically at Mars Hills, he was reformed. He goes out to Arizona. He's not reformed anymore. In fact, he talks how he's not reformed at this point, and everything changes like completely. And oh, by the way, let's just throw this out there. That's a drastic change in your understanding of doctrine. That's like huge difference. Yeah. That's tremendously different. But from that standpoint, it's interesting to just kind of see how that was all along the way. And Driscoll had so much power and so much control over the whole bus, to use that terminology, that, it's like they were gracious to him because he was the brand. But the reason why they weren't gracious with these other guys, like the elders who withstood him, is because Driscoll had all the power. He was the one who made all the decisions. Mm. And I think part of that, too, by the way, goes back to the money. I'll say this and we need to wrap up. I was astounded at how much financially they had invested in this one goofy book.
Yeah.
And how that chained them to Driscoll. They had to stay with Driscoll at that point. They had millions of dollars tied up in this process. And they ended up losing facilities and buildings because of that bad investment. I mean, so much of this is just a huge business model that was failed from the jump. There was a whole lot of other stuff involved in there. And I know we're out of time, but it's really interesting to see. But there's a lot of great lessons. And I think that key lesson so many of us have hit on is the need for humility, the need to make sure we're not the guy, right? We're not the focus. We need to make sure that that's something that we understand. Don't forget who you are. This is not about you. You're just a servant. You're just a messenger. You're not the star of the show.
Yeah, and Edward's comment I think is super important to catch. I'm going to, for this broadcast, I haven't really done that very much, but I'm going to pop this on there. I think that kind of keys into that. I didn't do this a lot this time. I was trying to be mindful of my power to highlight. But I want to include this. I think it's important to think about it this way, and it ties into the economics of this. Terry's talking about the extreme investment into this garbage book. And by the way, that same garbage theology in Real Marriage makes its way into class material produced by members of churches that we are connected to. Yeah. But let me phrase it this way. There was a point where the media empire that really was making the show pony of Driscoll popular had more financial backing than most local news programs, if not national news programs. The amount of investment they put into social media and video production was extreme. And so they took their show pony and they brought him out to show. This is the inevitable outcome of that, where the show pony wasn't up for the competition it was being put into. So here's the turn of the context. Over the last 18 months, if not last 2 years, all of us have engaged in sharing our media in essentially the same way that they were doing with Driscoll's message over his work. And if you go back and look at the archives of the Mars Hill website, it's probably better than most of the church's websites that you're going to encounter that we're associated with. It's still pretty good. So that makes you ask the question. If I'm the show pony, and you might be sometimes, what's going to happen when it comes out that the participants in the show didn't really have the same heart for the work that the show pony did? I can say with confidence for the 5 of you that I know your commitment to kingdom principles. I know your character well enough to say you guys are all in. But there's a component of the brethren that we work with and around that don't have that same level of commitment. And we've got to do something in our work to enable protection for those who are being hurt and harmed, and they are. Strength to those who share the same work that we do, and they need it. And lead in a way that really emphasizes true kingdom transformation. Now, it's no surprise that I am super annoyed with political partisanship, but I'm even more hurt by the way that brethren treat brethren.
Amen.
in spite of those political issues. And I think there's a lot of that highlighted in this podcast that is the real human tragedy that is super important to us. There's garbage in the relationship of brethren that is destroying the work of God. And that is we who lead. Look, if we want the praise for success, we have to accept responsibility for failure. And it's part of the churches we've been part of before, we're presently part of, and our futures. Colleges, community programs, the whole 9 yards. So that's like my last little self-reflection on this is, hey, look, I'm as much of a problem for the failures as I am much of a problem for the successes.
Yep.
I'll leave it for that. You guys can say what you want to say, get off my soapbox just a little bit. But we can go around the horn a little bit. We can do our normal close, whatever you all want to do. You can respond to me and say I'm a heretic. I'm comfortable with that.
Hey, can I make a request? I'd like to hear you guys do some episodes. Maybe you've done it. I haven't caught them all. But, there's a lot emphasized at the end about how what was supposed to be the good news wasn't really the good news. And he asked that question in the last episode, like, what was really good about all this? When you look back and you take the money away and the power away and the recognition away, what was really good? And there's a lot said about women. I think that we're pendulum swinging all the time, and we have this feminine, effeminate world, equalization world of every role. And so we want to get over here and be like, men be men and men be leaders and women be submissive. And yet, as I said, they weren't even qualified to do a lot of the counseling that they did, but women were in abusive relationships and women were objectified sexually. And this counterculture move they made of the biblical role of men demeaned women and hurt them and damaged them dramatically. And I don't know if you guys have talked about that as a preacher, but I think some episodes on finding that proper balance could be healthy, because a lot of marriages came out severely damaged or destroyed from a lot of things that got taught there about men and their power.
I think one of the things too, Edwin kind of pointed this out. One of the negative side effects of all this is that it's really sad that this podcast took such an egalitarian kind of angle that anybody who's more of a complementarian, which I think all five of us would probably be classified as to some degree, it kind of makes us all look like Driscoll. And I just want to put this out there that just because you believe in a biblical view of the home and of gender roles doesn't mean that you're Driscoll. And I think that's one of the sad negatives of this. And I think, and we do need to do some stuff about this, Chris, because it is going to become more of an issue. I mean, I've got a daughter who is free-spirited. Phil knows that. He's got a daughter similarly, and who's challenged a couple of guys before about that and said, so basically all you want me to do is fill juice cups and make bread. And that's the totality of my service. And I think that's a misrepresentation, but I think we're poorly equipped to help our sisters grow and be active in the work in godly ways, that we've not emphasized that. In some ways, we might have been more like Mark Driscoll than we want to admit. So yeah, we need to talk about that a little bit more, and yet be cautious that we're not labeled heretics in the process, probably.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'll add, kind of as we're bringing it to a close, I think Paul had a comment about this earlier, and it goes even a little bit with what you're saying. When I finished the last episode a couple of days ago, I really tried to think back through all of it to think about are there any positives there? Is there any hope to be found in this really tragic story? And it's very limited for sure. I mean, it's very much on the, you don't want to be like this or have these things happen. But one interesting thing that I really kept thinking about, and it kind of goes to where we are, and I had to read into it and build into it myself a little, but it was interesting, especially early on in the first few episodes, when it was bringing out about his teaching surrounding the home, the leadership in the home, and the roles of the husband and the wife, and how counterculture that was, especially to his area of the country. Now, he went about that in all the wrong kinds of ways. There's no question about it. But yet, at the same time, I think there was something to be said by how that loose biblical teaching was still resonating with people. I mean, thousands of people made the comment that really, really made a big difference for them. And what that told me is that, listen, there's still power in the truth, and it needs to certainly be delivered in some way. But, if we're looking for, some hope, there was a little bit of that for me, that here, even poorly preached biblical truth was resonating with people, thousands of people. And they, they even made, the comment about it, especially in that family dynamic. There wasn't much else. And they kind of left after the first few episodes. It went very much about Driscoll, but that really kind of stuck with me. And that's, one thing I was really thinking about yesterday a lot. I think that still is something, even in our culture, people are clamoring for, maybe more than we give the world credit for, and that's kind of a hopeful thing, for me and myself moving forward for sure.
We just need to do it in the right way. I'll say one more thing about
Yeah,
women.
that's right.
Struck me is, in the church today, she said, I couldn't get to help unless my husband was between me and the help. And a lot of it is a distance relationship between elders and women in the church. I feel that disconnect. They know how to deal with men. They know how to kind of do that thing, but the women can't get the help they need from pastors because the male system. Now, here's what happens often in the church is, in its place, women go and they spend a lot of time with women, which can be good. But in my experience, and I hear it secondhand, they don't let me go, and I don't think I should go. But there's a lot of over pouring out of buckets. There's a lot. I mean, when women helping women is a good thing. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but it can definitely become TMI and
gossip.
Very strange. But we have to find a way as elders and preachers to work with couples in a way that respects women and also can speak directly to them in a better way. So I don't know, you guys may can deal with that. It's just something on my heart. It just broke my heart to hear these testimony. I was listening to it with Summer with my wife, and she's like, who is this lady? I said, I don't know her, but I feel for what has happened in her life. And she went to a place and she told everybody everything about herself, which is what we want people to do. Just come pour out your bucket. I mean, not in the way they did, and in the end, the nature of the help did not have her best spiritual interest and Jesus' interest best for her in its heart.
Yeah. I dropped a note in the comments. The guy said I could plug my podcast this week. We talked about bullying this week, and David and Bathsheba is one example of that. A person who is in position to take advantage of a situation. He does it. He gets away with it. At least generally speaking, he gets away with it. He loses the child in the end, of course, but he keeps the woman, and the woman winds up being the mother of the next king. Bullying works in the short term. That doesn't mean that bullying is okay. It's just because Mark Driscoll can fill the pews and fill the bank account and all that kind of thing, just because people get away with it and the building doesn't catch on fire today, doesn't mean we're doing things God's way. And we need to have some humility and the patience and the trust in God's plan to do things in his way and help all these things work out in God's way, not make it all about us.
Well, it's about time for us to wrap things up for at least today. There's certainly a lot of things that we want to continue to explore down the road, and we'll probably make them part of upcoming vlogcasts. I want to include a couple tidbits, and this is more on the what now thing, and what do we need to learn? How do we help? Something that I have done over the last few years, whenever I've been invited to speak in an extended series somewhere, I specifically include a lesson about spousal abuse, particularly male-dominant spousal abuse, because I think it's something that needs to be part of the conversational space of the leadership of local churches. It usually has a complementary lesson that connects to abuse generally and other aspects. I just think it's something that needs to be happening. You've got some problems. Let's deal with it. Let's talk about it in a godly way. Maybe the sermon's necessary. Maybe a Bible class is necessary. And maybe we understand this. Any group can turn into a mob. And so a ladies' Bible study can turn into a mob. A men's Bible study can turn into a mob. But leadership can take the zeal of a group or a mob and change it into something transformative. And so something that I think really needs to happen is enabling leaders with the skill and humility to determine, hey, is this a thing I need to deal with, or someone who is skilled needs to deal with? For years, I used to say things like, yeah, I'm not a counselor, but I know some great ones. Let's talk about it. As you get older, there's some things you realize, yeah, you can handle if they're in the parental space, if they're in the relational space. But there's some things that still I just can't handle. And maybe I need my wife's participation in that, or maybe I need more of the humanity of the people I'm worshiping with involved with it, or maybe a very skilled professional to deal with some things that really go beyond my particular skill set. Paul talks about spousal strength that comes into wives, into wives or shepherds, wives of shepherds or wives of evangelists. And yeah, that's there. I think broadly, I want to close with this. If the church that you're part of is struggling right now in any of the areas that are highlighted through your listening of the podcast, I want you to know you're not alone. You're absolutely not going to be abandoned by your brethren. And if we individually, the five of us, I can speak for us in this regard, can be of help to you, reach out to us directly. You don't have to group text us. If you feel uncomfortable talking to any of the five of us, just pick one of us. I can guarantee you we'll respond and say, how can we help? There are brethren locally who will help you. If you're not comfortable talking details with us, we can find somebody who you can talk details with, whether it's congregational issues, individual issues, the whole basket. They need to be dealt with. Structurally, also for our broadcast, we're not going to have one next week. We're going to have that holiday week off. And so we'll be looking to pick up, I think maybe the first one might be the 28th of December for our next time together. And we'll start talking about some other things. Any last quick comments from the other four guys here before we sign off? I think, more Jesus, much more Jesus is the expectation from Chris.
It's not do the work unless we say it all goes back to the garden, right? But I mean, hey, Adam and Eve.
Hey, but does it hurt you on the inside to not cite that?
It does. It does
bother you a little bit to not cite the source.
Adam and Eve chose self over God in Genesis 3 ultimately, and same thing going on, man. That's what happened here. So, just the nuts and bolts of all this theologically is always focus on God and make it about Him. Much more Jesus, right Chris?
Yeah, and know this: whenever you talk about two different Bible passages that aren't in the same paragraph, you're doing theology. So don't let anyone tell you that you don't do theology if you're willing to take two different scriptures and place them on the same page.
I read too, but don't tell anybody.
Yeah, well, you read picture books. Jeremy, you got last comments? Any things you want to throw at Terry? You're a special guest. You to get you their first time participant.
No, I'm good. I think we've hit it about as hard as we can hit it for this hour and a half.
All right, everyone. Y'all take care.
I'll leave Terry and Bill alone.